Welcome to the Philly Prime Podcast. I'm Dave Schratweiser. It's being called one of the biggest political comebacks in history. Donald Trump sweeps his way back to the White House over Vice President Harris in an unbelievable race that spanned from one coast to the other. And the red wave, Bruce Gordon is joining us today. Bruce, the red wave wasn't there in 2022, but it was there this year.
Yeah, it sure was. There's no question about that. As we always talk about, there are only a handful of states really in play, but it looks now that all 7 of the so-called swing states out of the 50 U.S. states are going to go Donald Trump's way. A variety of reasons for that, and we'll certainly get into it. But the polling at the very end was very close. So this was not mathematically stunning, but I don't think many people thought either one of the candidates was going to take all 7 of the swing states. In the end, most of them were relatively close, although not absolutely razor close. But I don't think many people predicted Donald Trump would take all 7 of the states, and it looks like that's exactly what he's going to do.
All right, let's get your opinion, Bruce, on this win. I don't think anybody saw a win of this size for Donald Trump or Vice President Harris. I think, as you said, most of the polls were neck and neck, razor thin, all the way down to the end, that kind of thing. But just give me you did a lot of commentary on Fox 29 on Tuesday night and again yesterday on Wednesday. Your thoughts on the size of this victory and the width and breadth of it, so to speak, from east to west?
Well, I think one of the things that has kind of interested me, and I did some more number crunching, which I like to do because sometimes politics comes down to basic math. We can spin things all we want. We can try to insert our opinions all we want. But in the end of the day, the math is what it is. And one of the things that I found fascinating was that for all the talk of the inroads that Donald Trump has made with various subsets of voters, whether it's Black men or Latino men or young white males, with all of the talk of the inroads and progress and growth that Mr. Trump has seen with those categories, at the end of the day, when the final count comes in nationally, he is going to have almost exactly the same vote count he had 4 years ago, remarkably enough. He right now is in the 72 million and change range. And 4 years ago, he had about 74.2, 74.3 million voters in his camp. Now, given the fact that in 4 years, the country's population has grown, albeit very modestly, that is barely treading water in terms of his support. Remember, 4 years ago, that 74 million was good enough to get beaten by 7 million votes by Donald Trump, or by Joe Biden, I'm sorry. What happened here is that Kamala Harris, for a variety of reasons that we can certainly get into, wildly underperformed that Joe Biden performance from 4 years ago. We said that Donald Trump had 74 million then, 74 million more or less now. She right now is at about 68, 69 million votes, which means she could wind up anywhere from 11 to 12 million fewer votes than Joe Biden had just 4 years ago. So this is as much about a Kamala Harris failure as a Donald Trump success. At the end, it doesn't matter. Donald Trump is the winner by a clear majority, not only in the electoral college, but certainly there's not going to be any controversy this time around about, well, he lost the popular vote. There's virtually no chance of that happening. So it is an absolute victory for Donald Trump. And let's be fair here also. Part of the race is not only making yourself look as good as possible, but banging down your opponent to make them look as bad as possible. And there's obviously there was some success there. But the real difference here wasn't the Trump number. It was Kamala Harris falling far short of Joe Biden's number. And in part, that's perhaps because of her failures as a candidate, her shortcomings as a candidate. But also, let's be again fair, she also was inexorably linked to a Biden administration that was simply put unpopular for a variety of reasons that we can debate from now to the cows come home. She was linked, obviously, naturally, to the Biden administration that has had poor job approval numbers almost from day one.
Also, I think you got to look at the fact that, she only had 107 days, I believe, in the race here. A lot of people critiquing this in the last day or two are saying that the Democrats should have made a decision early on to not go with Joe Biden over a year ago, have an open primary, let them battle it out to come out with the best candidate possible, including Vice President Harris, if that was the case, and then would have had a longer chance to kind of let the viewers know what she was about. I'll say that on the one side, but on the other, the chances she did have in 107 days to answer some of the questions about the key issues in the case, the economy, the border, crime, things like that, she didn't answer. And I think she kept attacking. She kept saying generally where she was, but didn't get too specific. A couple of podcasts and shows she went on, she flubbed badly. I think that's part of what you're talking about her underperforming. And at the end of the day, when you look at the different voting groups, there's some significant gains by Trump in those voting groups and some significant failures for her to get that vote. And I think at the end of the day, that leads to obviously he wins the electoral college and he wins the popular vote, which I did not think was going to happen. I thought he could win the electoral college and probably not win the popular vote. But even the size of that victory is 4 to 5 million right now.
Yeah. Well, a lot to unpack there, much of which I agree with. I would say this, however, again, getting back to the basic math, there's no question the polling suggests that Mr. Trump made some significant gains with this group and this subset and so forth. At the end of the day, if he winds up with the same total number of votes, what that suggests is that those new groups, those new inroads with different groups, did nothing more than replace voters who had turned away from him. The small percentage of Trump supporters who between last time and this time said, I'm out. I'm not going to support Donald Trump anymore. So you had a growth in one area, a diminution of support in the other. And in the end, he's right where he started, which this time around was plenty good enough to do the job and win the election. Regarding the length of the Kamala Harris campaign, look, most folks, even those who disagree with him politically, will tell you that Joe Biden, President Biden, is a decent person, a good guy, and a guy who means well and is just a person of some character, whether you agree with his policies or not. However, I don't think history is going to judge him very kindly with regard to how he handled this last year or so. You'll recall that when he took office, the implicit promise was that he was a candidate who was sort of a bridge candidate, right?
Transitional candidate. Yeah.
He was right. He was going to transition and bridge us from the chaos of the Trump years back to a time of normalcy and decency and so forth. Again, you could agree with that pitch or disagree with it, but that was the pitch. The implicit promise there was 4 years, especially at my age, 4 years, and I will pass the torch to the next generation of leadership, hopefully within my party, the Democrats, but I'm going to pass the torch. That was the message from Joe Biden. In the end, hubris takes over, and it was clear that he had no intention of bowing out after one term. And only when it became incredibly obvious that he was not up to the task after that, frankly, disastrous performance in the June presidential debate with Donald Trump, did it become clear he had to get out. By the time he got out, it was late. Now, we can certainly talk, and we'll talk, I'm sure, in the next few minutes about Kamala Harris's failures on the campaign trail, and there were many. But I don't think that Joe Biden did her any favors by getting out of this race as late as he did. Everything changed because of that, including the simple fact, as you mentioned, that there was no time for even sort of a mini primary among Democrats to pick the candidate that their voters really wanted. Maybe a Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, maybe a Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, maybe even someone like a Pete Buttigieg in the Biden cabinet, or a Gavin Newsom, governor of California. Who knows whether they would have beaten out Kamala Harris for the nomination, but no one ever really got the chance because this was kind of wired from party officials. Now, I would say party officials in this kind of scenario have every right in the world to choose the candidate that they want. But the voters of both of their party and, more broadly speaking, the general election electorate has a right to reject that candidate. And in this case, that's exactly what they did. Party officials said Kamala Harris is our choice, is our nominee. Okie doke. But Democrats clearly said, we're not all that interested. We don't like what we see in Kamala Harris, and we're not going to vote for her. And they didn't.
Okay. What did Donald Trump do right to get this win? And what did Kamala Harris do wrong? In your estimation? I mean, you can break them down whatever way you'd like, but just kind of what do you think gets him to victory and leaves her with a defeat?
Well, and we can take this in any order you want, I guess. I think in this case, again, and I don't want to make this sound like it's just a bashing of Donald Trump, but I do
No.
think in any, even in a sporting event, right? Sometimes you'll say, well, this team won, but really this team more lost it than the other team won it. When you look at the simple math of this, again, Donald Trump being exactly where he was 4 years ago, Kamala Harris falling well short of where Democrats had been in 2020, I think it is more a question of what she did wrong than what he did right. So let me start there. I think, first of all, and the polling was very clear about this, right? When she got the nomination, and then shortly thereafter, the Democratic National Convention got underway, there was all this buzz, all this excitement, and the Democrats have turned the page, and now it's a whole new ball game, a whole new race. But even then, the polling went from an almost certain Donald Trump victory to a kind of a toss-up. Kamala Harris never had strong leads, I mean, meaningful, strong polling leads in any of these swing states. She had measurable leads in some of the early polling, but nothing super strong where you said, wow, this has gone from an almost certain Trump victory to an almost certain Kamala Harris victory. She said, once the convention ended, you always get, both parties always do, a little bit of a bump in the polling when the convention ends, this feeling of good spirits, and you've just had this 4-day pep rally. And she basically laid low, did virtually nothing on the campaign trail, did very few, really no significant interviews, no meaty interviews to kind of explain who she was and what she's about. And let's be honest, when you are the vice president, it doesn't matter that, yes, you are technically an elected official, you're an elected office holder, but the reality is your views and your opinions get tamped down necessarily because, again, you're the vice president. You're not going to sit there and offer up your views, especially if they differ from those of the president, the person who's right down the hallway in the Oval Office. And so for 3.5 years, she was just sort of there as vice president. And and on one hand, you can then criticize her for doing nothing while certain problems got worse, right? You did nothing. Well, most vice presidents don't do much any more than Mike Pence or any other vice president. But you can also then be linked to whatever's going wrong. You were there and you saw these commercials over and over, right? You, Kamala Harris, were there for the last 3.5 years. What did you do to solve this problem or that problem, inflation or immigration and so forth? So I don't think she did a very good job there. And frankly, part of it is just a function of being a Democrat from California. The reality is that those attack ads virtually write themselves, and Kamala Harris helps those ads get written because I don't know about the commercials that you saw, but my goodness, commercials about prison inmates getting taxpayer-funded transgender surgery, and then she's on camera supporting that from several years ago, not 25 years ago, mind you, but not all that long ago. Those commercials ran on a loop. And while that issue might have a 1 in a million chance of affecting your daily life or my daily life, they sent a message that she is out of touch. They sent a message that she's the typical sort of California liberal. And just as Democrats failed with Michael Dukakis, a Massachusetts liberal in 1988, and John Kerry, a Massachusetts liberal in 2004, the sort of coastal elites just don't work for the Democratic Party. And I think this was another example of that. And you're right, by the way, on some of the other quick issues, just rattling down the list, she was not particularly strong in interviews. I don't know that she was terrible, but she was not particularly strong in interviews. And when she was asked specific questions about specific policies, couldn't come up with answers that were solid and informative. And one final thing before I forget, she was given opportunities to separate herself from a rather unpopular Biden administration.
Right. That's where I was just going to go. My feeling is that Donald Trump did a good job painting that picture. As hard as she may have been thinking she's trying to distance herself from Joe Biden, she really didn't do that. And when given an opportunity on The View, Stephen Colbert, a couple of other shows, tell us the difference between you and Joe Biden, she flubbed The View badly. That was a softball question on a tee with the big bat you could have hit out of the park. Flubbed that badly. And then later that night went on Colbert's show and did it again. And then didn't try to correct it or fix it or do that kind of thing. And then made it worse by saying and agreeing, I was the last person in the room before the pullout in Afghanistan. I was the last person in the room before this on the border. And yes, I said yes as my vote with the president before I left the room. It's hard to distance yourself when you do that. And I thought former President Trump did a good job of painting that picture, pounding away at that picture, and not letting her move away from those answers. And I think those are the things, again, and the other mainstream media, I don't think pounded away on that at all. I think the Fox people did night in and night out, but I didn't see that. And, I think that was one of the more important issues. How do you turn the page when the book you're turning the page from, you were in that book and you helped author that book? You're right. It's not her issues and it's not her positions. It's Biden's, but you're linked to that. And I don't think she got rid of that link at all.
No, I agree with that. And I would also add this, and that is that, look, it's not easy. When someone has chosen you as their vice president, it's the greatest honor, generally speaking, of your life that someone has chosen you as a vice president in their administration. And so you owe something to them on a personal level. And I don't doubt that there was some personal fondness and so forth, or at least usually is, between a president and their vice president. But now it's time to put the big girl or big boy pants on when someone asks you a question like that. The candid political answer is to say, here's where I differ from the president. Here's where I would have done things differently. Now, of course, the follow-up there is, okay, well, if you would have done it differently, did you voice that concern? Did you voice that opinion?
Right.
You were in the room, as vice presidents always like to say that they are. They want to make sure that you're aware that they weren't just sitting around cutting for 3.5 years. So she was in the room, and they all are. Okay, if you were in the room, did you express those views and say to the president, I disagree, I think we should do this instead of this? But it never got to that follow-up question because she simply either couldn't or wouldn't say what she would have done differently from an administration that all of the polling said was unpopular. Now, you can debate why it was unpopular, but the polling was what it was. The Biden administration had poor job approval numbers, and those numbers were bad, again, almost from the jump, but certainly several months in. And she never seemed to figure that out, and that is to her detriment.
Yeah. Let me ask your thoughts on the big interviews that Donald Trump did. All the big interviews. We'll get to the podcast that he did and the effect of that a little bit later. But he took all comers. You want to interview me for an hour? I'll take it. You want to do a town hall? I'll take it. You want to do this? You want to do that? I'll take it. She did not do the big interviews, and she didn't do them when she did do several of them, one or two, Brett Baer with Fox, that kind of thing. She didn't do them early enough, I think, to build up.
Well, she never did Rogan, right? She never did Joe.
No,
Rogan.
Never did Rogan. Never. I don't think she did Theo Von either. Those got huge numbers. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But I think she missed the boat there. I think she should have gone on early, got the cobwebs out, or got the nerves out, or whatever it was about talking in a big interview situation. Listen, was she terrible with Brett Baer? No, she was feisty. She fought back. I think they liked the way she pushed back on him. Did he get to do everything he wanted in 22 minutes? No. Did they show up late? According to Fox, they did. Did they leave when they wanted to leave? Yeah, they did. But having said that, if she had done that earlier, maybe she would have been more accomplished at that. By the time we got to the last month, she could have done some bigger interviews and maybe scored some more points. But I didn't see that at all. I mean, I don't know who advised about staying away from big interviews, but with all due respect, that was a failure in my book.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think there's any question about it. And look, and I'm gonna push back only in this regard. There is absolutely a double standard. And while there are folks who will say the double standard is that the mainstream media is sort of in the bag for whoever the Democrat happens to be, that may well be that they lean in that direction and their coverage reflects that. And we can talk about that as well.
Yeah.
There's no doubt in my mind that there is also, though, a double standard in terms of when we talk about Donald Trump doing these interviews, he absolutely does. Much of what he says is objectively false, not spin, not, just plain false. For example, we will see now, of course, one of the claims that Mr. Trump made, now President-elect Trump, was that he would essentially resolve this Russia-Ukraine war by getting him in the room before he even took office as president-elect. He's going to get them in a room and resolve that issue. Well, we'll see. We'll see how that works out. I wouldn't bet money on that war being resolved before Mr. Trump takes office, but we'll see. But there's no question. He did the interviews and he subjected himself to interviews he knew were going to be hostile, so to speak, while she did not. And I don't think that sends the right message. You can, it may be fine with your hardcore supporters to say, if you're, say, a Democrat, well, I'm not going on Fox, they're not going to be fair to me. And they may
Right.
say, good for you. We don't need to have you going on that. Well, guess what? There are folks in the middle who watch Fox and other programming of that kind. And if you don't go on there, you've got no chance of connecting with those folks, no chance of changing any minds. And you look like, again, like you were afraid to do those interviews, as opposed to, well, I'm standing on principle. That's why I'm not doing the interview.
Yeah. Can we talk about Pennsylvania a little bit and talk about this? Some of what I've heard since her defeat was that she did not reach suburban white women enough. In the 5 collar counties around Philadelphia, she wins all except Bucks County. Numbers are pretty good, 49% to 56.5 to 42.5 in Chester, 61.2 to 37.8 for Trump in Delco. Statewide, she's got, fairly decent numbers and stuff like that in some of those counties. But what do you think there? I mean, where do you see the failure in Pennsylvania? Was it in those collar counties, not a big enough win there?
It was.
Or what was it?
I talked about this almost endlessly, almost perhaps annoyingly before the election. And I've talked about the last couple of days, and I've been crunching.
You're never annoying on this podcast, just so you know. Okay.
Tell my wife that.
Right.
She needed, simply put, Kamala Harris, needed a massive victory in Philadelphia and a very, very, very strong victory in Bucks, Chester, Montgomery, Delaware counties, the 4 collar counties right around Philadelphia. She needed that for a variety of reasons, one of which is the broad swath in the middle of Pennsylvania, the middle 2/3 or so of Pennsylvania is red, and probably deeper red, perhaps, than it was 4 years ago. So the only way she was going to win Pennsylvania, not that it was impossible, obviously, but the way she needed to win Pennsylvania was to win huge in Philly and almost as huge in the collar counties, which is possible these days because obviously, as you know, those counties have been trending blue now for the last several election cycles. Simply put, she didn't do it. Not only did she not outperform Joe Biden's 2020 performance, she vastly underperformed it. And I've been crunching these numbers all day. 4 years ago, the Democrats, because we've got different candidates, we'll say Democrats and Republicans. The Democrats in 2020 came out of Philadelphia with a vote margin, and I always go with margins rather than percentages because the vote margins, that's really what matters, of about 471,000 votes. In other words, 471,000 more Democrats than Republican votes. This time around, 411 was the margin. So 60,000 smaller, 60,000 votes smaller of a margin for Democrats. In the collar counties, in those 4 collar counties, the numbers were 58,000 fewer. The margin was 58,000 less than it was 4 years ago. 293,000 votes for the Democrats in those 4 counties aggregate 4 years ago. This time around, 235. Now, add up that 58 and the 60 in Philly. That's 118,000 votes smaller of a margin coming out of just southeastern PA. And what are you losing Pennsylvania by? About 134,000 votes.
Yeah.
So virtually the entirety of that loss is due to her underperforming in Philadelphia and in the collar counties. And we can drill into the specific groups that she didn't connect with. But the bottom line is she needed big wins in this particular part of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, simply did not get them.
Yeah. And I saw a number floating around all week, like 400,000, maybe because of the pandemic, everybody was asking for mail-in ballots and didn't want to go to the polls back in 2020. But I saw a number floating around all week of she had to make up 400,000 potential votes, and that Philly was where she kind of needed to do it. And people were throwing around numbers like she needs to get 700,000 votes in Philadelphia. She got 529,783 the last look I had in Philly. It might be a little bigger than that. So she kind of falls like 280,000 short of what they were saying would help her make up for all the rest of the state. Is that what also happened here too? Some of the numbers that dwindled statewide, she didn't make them up all in one place, or Pittsburgh and Philly?
Yeah, there's no question that a lot of this was about turnout, which suggests a lack of enthusiasm for her campaign. I think this is fascinating. Remember, I told you a minute ago that the difference between last time and this time in, let's say, the city of Philadelphia alone, right, was 60,000 less, right? 471 margin down to 411 margin. That's 60,000. Well, how did we arrive at that 60,000? Well, Donald Trump got about 9,000 more votes than last time. She
Right.
got 51,000 fewer votes. So the vast majority of that loss of margin in the city wasn't necessarily Donald Trump coming up, but it was her coming down.
Right.
So did he come up with some new constituents? Yeah, 9,000 in a city of 1.5 million. But
Right.
the bigger difference, the big drop, was Kamala Harris. I can't speak to the issue of mail-in votes. And the reason I'm hesitant to is because it's
Sure.
hard to know how much of that was pandemic related and people then saying, yeah, it's very convenient, but there's not a pandemic going on now. I've got the time and I don't mind going over to the polling place to vote this time when I
Right.
wouldn't have done that 4 years ago. So I really can't speak to that. But I do
But
know.
if you look statewide, her underperforming and then him maybe overperforming, even if it's not a big number,
Yeah.
when you do that in every single county or most of the counties across the state, that kind of compounds her problem. I mean,
Yeah.
she's not reaching Biden numbers and he's doing better than Trump numbers in 2020. And I think that was the case in most of the counties. He kind of outperformed what he did in 2020. And when you combine the two, as you just said, adding those two numbers together, that really blows the problem up even bigger. And then you have a much bigger hole to dig your way out of.
Yeah. In fact, I actually have the numbers right in front of me.
Sure.
2024. So last time to this time, Donald Trump's numbers statewide. And again, we still have a few more votes to count, but this
Sure.
is more or less complete.
Yeah, they're 98%, I think they're at right now.
Yeah.
Something like that.
He's
Yeah.
up 98,000 votes statewide. So call it 100,000 votes up for Donald Trump.
Okay.
Kamala Harris down 117,000 votes statewide. And
Right.
again, a few more votes to be counted. So in that regard, statewide, it was more or less even. He comes up, she comes down, and that's the race for Donald Trump. So
Right.
certainly in Philadelphia, it was much more of a failure of the campaign, of the Harris campaign. And interestingly, you may have read this as well. The Philadelphia Inquirer this morning had some extensive reporting on the rift between the Kamala Harris statewide and national campaign and the Philadelphia Democratic Party operatives, the party led in the city by the former Congressman Bob Brady. And there was some real bad blood, as the usual finger pointing, right? It was your fault we didn't get the vote out. No, it was your fault we didn't get the vote out. And it's unseemly and it's unfortunate no matter what party is on, but it's part and parcel of what happens when you lose a race. Well, it wasn't my fault. It must have been your fault. Well,
it's interesting. I had a call this week from a Democrat who I will say is pretty much in the know, and he cited two things there. One of them was that Bob Brady was a big fan of Joe Biden and didn't take kindly to the way they showed Joe Biden the door. And the other thing was that just didn't think without John Doherty, who's now in prison, former Local 98 union member who used to get 200 or so extra long Econoline vans down to the ballparks to go out and drag voters out of their homes to the polls. That wasn't there. Local 98 still has clout, but do they have Johnny Doc clout? No, they don't. So if you add maybe not totally enthusiastic support from Bob Brady and you have no John Doherty engineering getting out the vote there, that's probably two big factors in getting that number that she didn't get right there.
Yeah. I mean, look, it certainly could be. What I found fascinating within the reporting from the Inquirer this morning, among other things, you had the state and national party people saying, look, I'm sorry that we didn't come into Philadelphia and kiss Bob Brady's ring, but we did what we needed to do. We got out and did a lot of things to try to get our candidate across the finish line. But Brady's operation was, I think one of them called it, quote, worthless.
Yeah.
What's also interesting, of course, Brady on his side says, hey, they ignored us. They didn't get us the money we needed to get the Get Out the Vote organization operation going.
I heard that too.
Never even met with the candidate. Well, of course, the never met with the candidate comment was rather quickly rebutted when the candidate's operation sent a photo of Bob Brady posed with Kamala Harris on one side, Tim Walz on the other. So unless that was photoshopped, it seems pretty apparent they did meet. Now, was it the 2-hour long, behind closed door session perhaps that Bob Brady wanted? Perhaps not. No. But it came off looking not so great for Bob Brady to say, I never even met with her when
Right.
there's the
He
photo.
didn't get his 4th Street deli visit with her to have lunch. Maybe is that
Yeah,
maybe
and
what
I
it
think
was?
some of that
Something
is
like
just
that. That
rather
photo
petty
op.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of pettiness involved in that. Again, not
Yeah.
surprising the finger pointing that goes on when you've lost an election, but this idea that the party and the local folks didn't have the money they needed for the get out the vote. Look, I guess perhaps this is a somewhat naive way of looking at things, but if your candidate isn't strong enough or it doesn't have enough support to get voters out on their own, and you need to go to these kind of extraordinary lengths to get them, to drag them to the polls, then I don't have much sympathy for you if you didn't get those votes. Right?
Yeah.
The idea that this was all about a lack of money, for the local folks to get their get out the vote organization really up and running, I don't buy it. And I don't doubt for a minute, as you say, there's the element of Biden and Brady were I think particularly close. Look, there are people. Brady in this story in the Inquirer, frankly, says,
Sure.
"Hey, no, I don't hear anybody calling for my job or anything." But
Mhm.
it's also true that Bob Brady's been in that position for a long time.
Yeah.
And after an underperformance like this, who knows whether there are some folks who might start questioning whether they need some new blood in the city itself. Because again,
Right.
for all the analysts and all the talk about how well Donald Trump did, this was mostly a Kamala Harris failure in the
Mhm.
city of Philadelphia, certainly, even more than the counties.
Well, we talked about the last time you were on before the election about Sherelle Parker and what impact she could have, and Josh Shapiro, what impact he could have statewide. Um, I won't use the word blame, but do they have some responsibility for those numbers not being where they are? Sherelle Parker's a new star in the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
won big in Philly, has done a really good job, I think, in the first year in office in Philadelphia. Josh Shapiro, equally, was being considered for vice president. Some people say she should have chosen him instead of Tim Walz, would have won Pennsylvania. Let's not argue that right here. But having said that, rising star of his own. And you said, had there been a primary maybe last November or whatever, or in the spring sometime to replace Biden, maybe he could have been the guy. Maybe a wild card guy, maybe a sleeper, but maybe he could have been the guy. So do they, let's say, take any responsibility? Do they have any responsibility for that underperformance that you're talking about? Or does that lie solely with the Harris camp?
Well, I think it's mostly overwhelmingly with the Harris camp. I
Okay.
mean, for one thing, will there be some grumbling behind closed doors, perhaps, that Sherelle Parker did this, didn't do that? Perhaps, and I don't have any specific examples to give
No,
you.
and neither do I. I'm just asking a question.
But the reality is that this is the city of Philadelphia, and Sherelle Parker is a Democrat, and the likelihood that she is not going to be reelected in a couple of years is extremely unlikely. And so the idea that there's going to be some big political price to pay for the city underperforming, for Harris underperforming the city, I think is unlikely. Similarly, I think it's unlikely that Josh Shapiro, again, a little complaining here and there, perhaps, behind closed doors mostly, again, perhaps, but I don't see it costing him anything in the long run. And I think maybe you and I might have talked about this before the election, quite frankly, and I'm not suggesting for one moment that Josh Shapiro was hoping for this result. Let's be very clear about that.
Oh, no, understood.
But as a factual matter, him not being chosen and them, meaning Harris and Walz, losing is a rather fortuitous circumstance for Josh Shapiro, because it puts him in a position now to have a free run at a presidential nomination, a Democratic presidential nomination in 4 years, rather than having to wait 8 years. If he had been chosen and they won, now he's locked into that for 8 years. If he had been chosen and they lost, now he could run in 4 years, but he's also doing so with the stench of defeat on him from being a defeated candidate before. So now, 4 years from now, let's play this out a little bit.
Well, that's where I want to go next, and you're going right there. Let's talk what this does to his fortunes.
Right. Well, again,
nationwide.
4 years from now, barring the unusual, because again, barring some rather unusual circumstances, Pennsylvania tends to reelect governors to a second term, Tom Corbett notwithstanding, but whether it's Ed Rendell or whether it's Tom Wolf, these things tend to be a two-term operation for Pennsylvania. And so 4 years from now, it's entirely possible that he is in the middle of a second term in office, so 6-ish or so years in the executive branch, running a big state, a big important swing state, when he decides to run for president. And frankly, I don't think anybody would criticize him. I mean, we know that Josh Shapiro is an ambitious guy, but I think people do tend to hold it against you if you get one job and then 6 months later, a year later, you're looking for the next job. He'd be 6 years into a potential 8 years as governor. I don't think he'd get criticized for going for the big brass ring, so to speak. In addition, he's in office at that point, again, assuming a reelection. He's in office, which means he has the megaphone, he has the microphone, he can make news every day. He's someone people are listening to. Whereas, again, if things had played out differently, none of that would have been the case. So I don't think he's a shoe-in for the Democratic nomination in 4 years. Lots of stuff can happen, but this certainly does not hurt his cause any. And one final reference to the choice that Kamala Harris made. Tim Walz was okay, as a vice president choice. I don't think it was a disaster, but he certainly didn't do anything to help her. That's very clear.
See, that's where I would disagree. I mean, you have to do something to help your candidate. In my mind, he did nothing to help her. Yeah, but frankly, I think he took her back a couple steps here and there in a few spots, but not the powerful person. Let me say this, whether you agree with J.D. Vance or you don't on some of his issues, he brought 125% to the field every day. And I think helped Donald Trump in some areas. I don't think Walz helped as much as they were maybe thinking he could in the Midwest. I just don't think that happened. If you look at the numbers, they lost those states in the blue wall. So
I would say two things. First of all, there's no question Walz did nothing for Kamala Harris. Not only did they lose, he was supposed to lead the guy with the Midwestern, street cred, if you will. Not only did they lose Michigan and Wisconsin, but I looked this up because I was somewhat gobsmacked by it. Yeah. While Kamala Harris won Minnesota this time around, no big surprise there. Her margin was smaller this time with the governor of Minnesota on her ticket than it was 4 years ago for Joe Biden. So there's no question that he was a net zero for her. I would only argue in the case of Vance that Vance's past comments, almost more so than his performance on the stump, his past comments, especially when he was out there hustling to sell his Hillbilly Elegy book, which became a bestseller. But when you're out on the trail and you're out selling a book, you've got to make interesting conversation with long form interviews when you're on these shows. And some of the comments that he made, I don't think helped at all, frankly. I don't know of anybody who voted for Donald Trump because of J.D. Vance. So I don't know that he gave him anything. I don't know that he hurt him necessarily at all. But specifically on the Walz front, Shapiro, I think, could have gotten the Democrats Pennsylvania. Again, 135,000 or so vote margin. I think Shapiro could have gotten Pennsylvania. I have no idea and don't claim to know whether he would have helped her win the other blue wall states of Michigan and Wisconsin.
Oh, I think he could have got her 200,000 plus in Pennsylvania. That would
have been enough for the victory.
For sure. And you would have got Pennsylvania. Now, whether that stops the cracks in the blue wall that fell apart, lopsided. Do me a favor. I heard a lot of talk the last couple of days about the bro vote in this election. Tell us what that is, since you're the political analyst, and tell me what you think of that. And did those folks come out? Because it sounds like they did.
It does sound like that, and I'll go back.
And it's early; it's 2 days after the election.
They've just been replacing voters who went away, because again, the final vote total was the same. But basically, these are young white male voters, in many cases non-voters previous to this election,
right?
Often without college degrees, and I don't say that as a pejorative, merely as these are how these things get sort of categorized. And they have seen Donald Trump, and they like what they see, and more specifically, I suspect they like what they hear. Whatever else you think about Donald Trump, he is assertive. He speaks in a manner that suggests he's a take charge kind of a guy. Now, again, I could point out many examples of things that he says that are just objectively false, but he says them assertively. We go back to the original, that disastrous debate performance by Joe Biden back in June. No question, Biden's performance was awful. lost in the sauce there was the fact that Mr. Trump made a variety of comments that were absurd on their face. And, you know, the kind of thing, again, I'm going to solve the Russia-Ukraine war while I'm just president-elect by getting these guys in a room, and I'm going to resolve it in a matter of days or so. Some of those comments got washed away because we were so busy, understandably, so busy talking about the disastrous performance by Joe Biden and the fact that he had no business running for re-election. So one of the phenomenons about Donald Trump is that while much of what he says could be shot down by any reasonably alert fact checker, the fact is he does speak in an authoritative way. He speaks in a way that suggests, again, somebody who's in charge, not going to take any guff. And this goes all the way back, quite frankly, to the image that was created when he was on The Apprentice. You know, here's the ultimate businessman. And, you know, you've got all these people who are theoretically somewhat successful people on their own, bowing and scraping before the business titan. And at the end of the day, he's going to tell them that, yes, they have pleased him, or no, you're fired. Yeah. And that image has built and built and built. And I think there's something appealing about that to young white males. All the polling, at least the exit polling, suggests that's the case. And it does.
And I think Trump was on the right points on the big two issues, the economy and the border. And I think those two issues play big into that vote we're talking about right there.
Yeah.
And I think his positions, with all due respect to the vice president, his positions were widely viewed as better on both of those issues. And she had to make a climb to get into that, even within a few points of him on those two issues. And I don't think she made that climb. And I think the abortion issue did not play as big as perhaps they thought it was going to play. And I think the numbers, if I looked at them, economy was in the Fox 100,000 person analysis they did leading up to the election, I guess the day of the election, 39% on the economy, 21% on immigration, only 11% on abortion. And clearly, I think on the first two, Trump had the upper hand. I don't think there's any disputing that in terms of that vote that you're talking about right there.
Let's take those real quickly. The abortion thing I think is particularly interesting because I believe I read, and don't hold me to this exact number, but I believe there was something along the lines of 10 different, in one form or another, referenda on abortion in the various states. Seven of them basically went in the direction of greater abortion rights, 3 not so, lesser rights, if you will.
Yes.
So what strikes me about that is that it's certainly possible, and I don't know how much ticket splitting there was, but it's possible that in some cases somebody could have said, the positive result for those abortion rights votes suggested people wanted more abortion rights rather than less. But it was certainly possible for a voter to say, I'm voting for more abortion rights as a separate referendum question on my ballot, but I'm not voting for Kamala Harris.
Yeah. So I think that's what happened. I do. I agree with you. I think that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I like this issue, but I don't like her on the other issues, so I can do both. I can have my case too. With regard to immigration, both sides have some mud on their hands. There's no question whatsoever that the Democrats, the Biden administration, did not move nearly fast enough to head off an issue that is not only a legitimate issue, but it's also a political liability, the idea of illegal immigration.
Sure.
No question that they did not do what they needed to do. And quite candidly, Joe Biden did his vice president no favors by saying, let's see, what's the most controversial and divisive issue in this country right now? How about immigration? Well, Madam Vice President, this is your job now. Have at it. Have a nice day and go solve it. Not a chance that was going to happen. And of course it did. And so the Democrats, to their everlasting discredit, did not move on that issue anywhere near as fast as they should have. Having said that, they did make a belated move in a bipartisan way, a piece of legislation negotiated by one of the more conservative senators in the Senate, Jim Lankford of Oklahoma. And they put together a piece of legislation that by most accounts would have gone a long way toward, if not solving the problem, at least improving the problem. And when Donald Trump got wind of that legislation, he made it very clear he wanted no part of it for Republicans. And suddenly the support that had been there disappeared. They left Jim Lankford out there, standing out there with his pants down, and walked away from it because, and this is hardly unique to Republicans, they wanted an issue to run on rather than a problem solved. And sure enough, the legislation went away. Jim Lankford was left scratching his head saying, wait a minute, I thought we had a deal here, and it's a pretty tough measure, and it went away. But again, Democrats could have done this a lot earlier than an election year. Republicans were not going to give them a victory on this issue in an election year. And the reason it was an election year, Democrats waited way too long to do anything about it.
Well, that's the argument I would make.
Yeah.
If you were so interested in immigration and solving this problem, why didn't you do that? You came in the first day and signed 98 executive orders, some of which shut down what Trump had going on the border. But then you waited 3 more years to come up with a bipartisan, Lankford-sponsored bill to do this. You waited too long. If you really were interested in dealing with that, and you knew if Trump's in the race, immigration was going to be an issue, you knew it, especially because you signed executive orders doing away with some of what he put in place there. So you knew that was coming back. Why'd you wait 3 years? Makes no sense. And why would you put her in charge of that and basically abdicate your responsibility, Joe Biden, as the president, to solve a problem that every country has borders and rules? You didn't do that. And I think that's that problem. And it came back to haunt them. I agree with you that if fleshed out enough and explained well enough, that bill might have answered some questions for some Republican voters about what the D's would do to deal with the immigration problem. It wasn't fleshed out, and it was fleshed out way too late.
Yeah, and in campaign,
if you were going to make a fight of it, you should have picked that fight in year 1, not year 4.
And in campaign commercials, you saw occasionally Democrats pointing that out, that they had this tough border bill, and the president, former president, shot it down. Look here, and we can talk about the economy in just a minute, but to put a bow on the immigration issue, look, now it's entirely possible that Mr. Trump will have both the Senate and the House. The House still somewhat in flux. The Senate, no question, he will have control of the Senate. And now we'll see whether what he wants to do on the border will happen. Because quite frankly, it's not as if the illegal immigration issue suddenly became an issue in the last 4 years. In the first 2 years of Mr. Trump's first administration, 2016, or really January of 17 to January 19, this problem wasn't fully dealt with or even in any significant way dealt with. The border wall that was going to be built and paid for by Mexico obviously never happened. What Mr. Trump has said on the campaign trail this time is that while the official number is something like 11 million illegal immigrants, somewhere they've pulled the number 20 to 25 million out. Let's say they're right. Let's say Mr. Trump is right. You're going to locate, track down, put behind bars for the time being, and then bounce out of the country 20 million people, the vast majority of whom are working in some form or fashion. Now, not only do I suspect that is logistically beyond impossible, not just unlikely, but impossible, but the impact on the U.S. economy, when you take millions of people and suck them out of the country because you've done, again, assuming you can even do the first part of that, which is to find them and put them in some sort of custody, good luck making any of that work. And I'm assuming that the wall will now be back on again. No one even pretends that Mexico is going to pay for it anymore. But
there's $650 million still sitting there that they can use to build the rest of that wall that has never been used. It's
right.
I think
$650
got brought up in a conversation with Harris, and she said, "Yeah, it's still there. We haven't used it." Right.
But as you know, Dave, $650 million, which sounds like a lot of money,
that'll get you 20 feet.
That'll get you about 150 feet of wall. It's remarkable how expensive some of that stuff is.
Let me say this. I think if Donald Trump comes in, you saw those numbers that were released about the criminal element of the illegal immigrants that entered the country. 15,000 murderers, 13,000 rapists, and a large number who have significant criminal records. I think for his voters, if he makes a good faith effort to locate those people, revet those people, and then deport those people, starting with those numbers I just talked about, 15, 13, and I think it's whatever the other number is in terms of folks with sizable criminal records, multiple convictions or multiple charges. If he makes an effort to do that, I think that satisfies the voters and satisfies one of his promises 65%. And then see if he finishes the wall. I think that helps a little bit there. Do I think anybody rationally thinks that he's going to gather up 20 million people and send them all packing. I mean, come on, that's not even close to rational,
right?
That's at any level. At any level,
the double standard is that when he says that, and he said it not once in an off-the-cuff remark. This is a regular line of commentary. His own supporters say, "Well, he doesn't really mean that." Well, on what planet does a politician get to say things on a regular basis, and their own supporters say, "Well, we know what he means. He doesn't really mean that. He merely means he's going to do 1/50th of that." I mean, that is sort of the double standard in its own right.
Sure. And it may be one of these 40 interviews he did, one-on-one interviews. Somebody should have pressed him on that. If Bruce Gordon sat down with him, you would have pressed him on that. Listen, Brett Baer did a lot of pressing on Vice President Harris in his interview. Would he have done the same with Trump if he interviewed Trump at that level? I don't know. Hannity didn't do that. Jesse Waters talked to him and J.D. Vance right after the convention. I didn't see that level of pushback, but you're right. Somebody probably should have said to him, well, before you get away from that, let's ask this question, and posed exactly what you just said. Can you really locate, find, and deport 20 million people?
And by the way, Dave, there's no question that you mentioned the 15,000 people. And let's, for sake of this discussion, let's say that's a legitimate number. That's a real number that these are.
Oh, yeah. Again, I'm going by it's a Border Patrol number. Yeah.
Yeah. Violent people. If, in fact, the number of illegal immigrants in this country is just 11 million and not the 20 million that Donald Trump says it is, that 15,000 really bad hombres, as Mr. Trump used to call them, represents 0.00136% of all the illegal immigrants. So it's, what is that? One out of 1,000, 1.3 out of 1,000 of the illegal immigrants represents that kind of danger. Now, I would fully agree with you. It should be zero, right? The likelihood that we're all going to catch every single bad person who comes in, I mean, really bad person, and not just a person trying to feed their family so they're coming here for some kind of work, it's not going to happen. But my point is, that's the math, right? That 15,000 represents a microscopic percentage of the illegal immigrants here. Most studies suggest they are, even if for only reasons of self-preservation, less likely to commit crimes while they're here than the average citizen, because they know they're going to get bounced out of the country if they wind up committing some awful crime and getting caught and prosecuted. That's its own story. I get it.
Right, because it hasn't happened, but go ahead.
Right. It is an effective campaign ad because it's the same kind of thing, frankly, with something like transgender issues, right? The vast majority of the public isn't impacted by it, but it can still stoke some outrage, understandably. Sure. So in these cases with illegal immigration, the numbers there that I just showed you, right? 1.3 out of 1,000 illegal immigrants is this violent person that we absolutely want out of here. But all it takes is a couple of headlines. All it takes is a couple of stories of some person, some innocent person murdered by someone who had no business being here. And it riles people up, and it's perfectly understandable why it riles people up. It's effective as a political communication.
Let's switch gears for a quick second here.
Sure.
I mentioned podcasts before, long form podcasts. Mr. Trump went on Joe Rogan for 3 hours. That's
a short show for Rogan, right?
That's a short show for Donald Trump, probably too. He likes to talk. That's a medium-sized rally speech, and I don't mean that as a knock. I'm just saying the guy likes to talk. On with another guy who likes to talk. Having said that, 46.5 million views on YouTube, 22 million views on X. He went on Theo Von's show, 14 million on YouTube, 42 million on X. The total number, and this is coming from an Instagram post I saw a little while ago, numbers provided by, I think, the Financial Times did this analysis. 250 million views without Spotify, Apple, and some of these other podcast platforms. I mean, is this the wave kind of the future? And now, I mean, I think it is. I think that's where some of that bro vote comes from. That's where suburban women might be listening. Suburban men on their ride home, listen to podcasts like this.
And I don't claim to be an expert.
Young people listen to podcasts.
I don't claim to be an expert on the demographics of the listenership to a podcast, but I have to believe that young white male audience those folks are big fans of the Joe Rogan podcast. And so it would not surprise me if they were listening and in some cases said to themselves, I like what I hear here. Look, there's no question the media landscape is changing. Traditional television is trying desperately to keep up with the changes, just as newspapers were trying to keep up. And it seems pretty clear, in my own view, it's unfortunate. Some people will say good riddance, but there's no question that newspapers have failed in their desire, largely have failed, not entirely, but most papers have failed in their attempts to kind of keep up with the changing technology. Television now is desperately trying to do various streaming services and so forth of their own. But these podcasts are clearly getting more and more popular for a variety of reasons, just one of which is what we just alluded to, Dave, and that is a guy like Joe Rogan gets a guest on, and if they want to talk for 3 or 4 hours about a variety of subjects, they can, which makes it much more desirable for the candidate to come on there and know that they're going to be able to give a long form answer. And sure, is someone with a bad intent going to take some 4-second snippet out of that and take a little bit out of context? Perhaps. But generally speaking, they get a chance to speak their mind in full rational thought. One of the reasons I've never been a big fan of Twitter, now X, is, and maybe it's just I'm too in love with the sound of my own voice, I don't want to make a point in 144 characters or whatever the new limit may be, or stretch it out over a string of 12 tweets or whatever to make a point. I don't think that's a particularly effective way of communicating complicated subjects. Folks love it. Good for them. It's not.
Well, and let me go back to, you talked about the immigration bill that looked good, was Langford sponsored, was going to go through and all that, and ended up not going through. If Vice President Harris was on Joe Rogan's show for 3 hours, she would have had an opportunity to flesh that issue out, explain that issue out. Whether you agree with her or not, and I'm not saying I agree or don't agree, I don't agree. But having said that, you would have had that opportunity to do that. Just for comparison, Bret Baier's interview with Vice President Harris on Fox, 7.8 million views. Trump's highest rated television interview was with Greg Gutfeld of Fox on the 10 o'clock show at night, 4.9 million. Those numbers, I won't even use the word pale in comparison to 46 million and 22 million on X and 14 million and 42 million on X. I mean, they're not even close. I happen to think that this is where people are going to go in the future in a nationwide race, and to some extent, even in a statewide race.
And you alluded to it just a little while ago, Dave. Look, the fact is that no matter how the interview goes, and short of it going just disastrously badly for you, in almost any case, the fact that you had the guts to go on with someone who you knew was going to disagree with you about a lot of issues, and that ranges from a guy like Joe Rogan, who tends to let everything I understand about his program, he doesn't do a lot of pushback. It's a lot of, tell us what you think, and folks can go for a while, to someone who is going to be absolutely grilling you left and right and not letting you get a word in edgewise, presumably. There's a whole range of those kind of interviews. However, I don't think there's any question that people generally come away with more respect, at least someone who's rational and reasonable. The fringe side, you're never going to convince, why worry about it? But the rational person in that middle 50%, and I think the rational middle may be that big, hopefully, they're going to give you credit for having the guts to go on those interviews and face some tough questions. This idea nowadays of, say, Democrats going on a show like The View, or Republicans only going on a specific Fox opinion show with Sean Hannity or whatever, you're preaching to the choir there, but I don't know that you're getting that you're convincing anybody of anything new or different.
All right, Bruce, listen, we're running out of time here. I could talk another hour with you about all this stuff, and I greatly
we'll turn this into the Joe Rogan experience. It's the
there you go.
Wiser experience.
So to speak. I appreciate you coming on. I know you worked hard this week. You had multiple days you were in talking about politics, and of greatly appreciate you coming on to do this. And
My pleasure.
hopefully we cleared up a couple of issues. We added some wealth to this conversation, and we'll see what happens down the road. And we'll have you back pretty soon.
Interesting times, Dave, and they will not get any less interesting in the weeks and months ahead, certainly.
All right, Bruce, thanks again. I appreciate it. That's Philly Prime Podcast for this week. Thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. And the next time we'll have Bruce back, we'll get into some more of this. Have a good week.